In today's video, I'll be revealing how to make $1 million portfolio last more than 35 years in retirement, even without a pension. Over my years helping hundreds of clients navigate retirement, I've identified these key strategies that can help you extend your retirement savings. And that's exactly why I'm making this video today, to show you how to optimize your portfolio and minimize inefficiency so that you can spend more money on memories and less money on taxes. Let's get right into it. So we're actually looking at Mike and Sarah, Mike age 60 and Sarah age 58. Now, to help you understand how to optimize your portfolio for long-term efficiency, felt like it would be helpful to look at a case study. So if we look at their personal financial statement, you can see they have cash on hand, they have a brokerage account, they have a Roth IRA, and then they have a pre-tax 401k. So about $1 million of investable assets, no pension. They do have a home and a mortgage tied to that property. And that's how we get to their net worth, which is just under $1.5 million. Now, I'm going to go more in depth and explain what each of these tiles are because they are important as we're reviewing your financial wellness and your retirement plan. But first, we're going to focus on this, the equity rate, and how do you optimize your portfolio for long-term efficiency? So number one, okay, you have to develop an income plan. Now, an income plan is typically approached one of two ways, right? There are people that say, how much can I spend? The other way to approach an income plan is, how can I spend X? So you're probably in one of these two fields. How much can I spend? This is typically people where time is more important than money, right? Like, I need to retire today. I'm willing to spend whatever I can. How much can I spend? How can I spend X is when money is more important than time, right? Like maintaining your standard of living, your lifestyle is more important to you than necessarily stepping away from work sooner, right? So these are typically the two ways to approach an income plan. If you have a certain lifestyle that you're pretty adamant to maintaining, and if you're falling short of your goal, really, you have a few options here. And retirement planning, income planning really is learning how to understand and know what is in your control and what's not in your control, and learning how to focus on what is in your control. Okay, so what are some of the levers that are in your control to help you get to where you want to be if you're not quite there? Well, one, you can work a little bit longer, okay? Which for some isn't very attractive, but for others, they find a sense of structure and purpose and relationship in their work, and so they're okay working longer. But maybe that's not your solution, so you can save more, right? So while you're working today, you can save more money for retirement. If that's not feasible, you can always try to earn more, right? And whether that's asking for a raise or getting a second job or investing in your human capital in some way that makes you more valuable on the market, like maybe a master's degree, an MBA, or as you approach retirement, that gets harder to do. So what this looks like more for retirees is potentially working part-time in retirement. Instead of going from full-time to full stop, earning more could look like slowly dialing back work in retirement, or maybe becoming a consultant and working part-time in something that you're passionate about, but you still have more autonomy. I don't know. Yeah, so anyways, that's an option. Another option, this one's can be a hard adjustment. You can just spend less, right? So these are the four levers that that are really, and well, if you have a comedian for a financial planner, they may even present this option. Okay, that's mostly a joke. These four things are really levers inside of your control to help you get to close the gap of how much can I spend. All right, so once you have an income plan and we know what we're optimizing for, whether we're figuring out sustainable spending today, right? Now we have to get into the strategy. We have to get into asset dedication. The idea behind asset dedication, and this is different than asset allocation, right? If you think asset allocation, that's more like your modern portfolio theory and maybe taking some risk tolerance questionnaire and then getting some cookie cutter model portfolio that's aggressive, conservative, balanced, right? Now, psychometricians have come out and said that these risk tolerance questionnaires aren't really effective because what you say you'll do in crisis versus what you actually do in crisis are two different things. But Markowitz, the father of modern portfolio theory, who won a Nobel Prize for his work, actually came back in 1991 and published a paper that said that this modern portfolio theory, this asset allocation way of investing, was really meant for institutional investors and not necessarily individuals, right? Because a retiree, an individual, has a specific income plan, a cash flow plan that is probably a better driver of how to invest the portfolio. In asset dedication, it's understanding that certain assets are better at certain jobs, right? So if we think about stocks, well, stocks are really good for long-term growth, right? Stocks are not good for grocery money. Like if you needed this money this year, the stock market is not where you want your money invested because there's no guarantee that the stock market is higher when you actually need to sell it and buy your groceries, right? But we know over long periods of time, the stock market tends to go up, right? So then if we think of bonds, okay, bonds are really good for short-term income. Bonds are not good for long-term growth. In fact, stocks, the equity premium is about 6% a year, meaning on average, stocks are expected to outperform bonds by about 6% a year. So if you have a long-term time horizon, you would want that money in the stock market, right? The point is with individual bonds, you know exactly how much cash flow to expect, right? And so when it comes to an income plan, that's why I am a fan of an individual bond instead of a bond ladder, instead of necessarily just a bond fund. Here, we are looking at a target date fund. Now, this is the Vanguard 2025 target date fund. And you can see, so this one fund, which is probably a very common default fund for a lot of you that have a large portion of your money in a 401k. And if you've never changed the investments or chose an investment, you're probably in some type of target date fund. It's a very common default investment. So you can see, so this one fund, I mean, it is diversified. You know, it has US equity, it has non-US equity, and it has fixed income, but it's all together in the same fund. The problem with this, when you are thinking of your income plan and needing to turn your life savings into a monthly paycheck, is when you're selling this fund to fund your grocery money, right? Then you're actually selling all of these things at the same time. And that's not really what we want to be doing, right? Because again, asset dedication, these assets are dedicated to different jobs in your portfolio. You don't want to be forced to sell all of them at the same time. Now, even inside the fixed income, if you have a bond fund and if you have to sell the bond fund to get your income, right? Well, now you're not isolated from interest rate risk. In the last few years, we have experienced and felt interest rate risk, right? From COVID and interest rates crashing down to zero, and then the quick rise of inflation rates or the quick rise of interest rates to combat inflation, right? We've seen how the interest rate volatility can impact these bond funds, right? So that's why if it were me investing in retirement, you know, I would not do a target date fund. I would have my separate stock funds, and I would not even have a bond fund. I would actually separate these even more to an individual bond ladder. So you're not worried about selling bonds, but you're actually mapping out and planning your income from these bonds based on the cash flow that you actually need in your retirement plan, right? And when you do this, you are immunizing your cash flow liability. Now we have to think of asset location. Okay. Now, asset location is which accounts are holding which types of investments, right? Because different accounts have different tax treatments, different investments have different tax treatment as well, right? And I can give you quick examples. Let's look at the three types of accounts. We have a taxable account, we have pre-tax accounts, and we have Roth accounts, okay? The reason that asset location is so important is because it's taking into consideration that wealth isn't necessarily how much you make, but it's how much you keep, right? So when we think of your investment plan, your after-tax spendable dollar is really the number that you're optimizing for. That's the number you want to maximize, like the amount of money you can actually use, right? You may have $1 million in your 401k and it may be all pre-tax. That doesn't mean that you can cash out today and spend $1 million, right? You're going to have to withhold taxes from that. So asset location, if we're thinking, how can we optimize your portfolio for long-term efficiency? We want to minimize taxes. We want to maximize your income. Asset location is a huge part of this. Now, I have seen companies, right, where if they've determined that your asset allocation is 60% stock and 40% bond, that they have applied that equally to all of your accounts, your taxable account, your pre-tax account, and your Roth account. Okay, that is not the right way to do asset location. If you are under the total return asset allocation model, which is very common in the industry, a better way to do that, if you're going to do that strategy, is maybe be 60-40 overall, but be more strategic of which accounts are holding the stocks and bonds. You may be 100% stock in your Roth account, and you may be more heavy on the bonds in your pre-tax account, but overall you would be 60-40, right? So that is a more optimal way of doing that strategy. So let's talk about something. First, there's some easy giveaways. So bonds work really well in a pre-tax account because bonds are not tax efficient assets. The income that you get from a bond is taxed as ordinary interest, right? Or ordinary income. Because of that, you can shelter that income inside of a pre-tax 401k or an IRA. If these bonds were in your taxable account, then you're getting a 1099 every year that is including the interest from those bonds, and you are paying taxes on that interest at your marginal tax bracket. We tend to want to put bonds here in a, shelter that income inside of a pre-tax account. Now, as far as your taxable account, what works really well here are your growth stocks that either don't pay dividends, right? Or maybe US stocks that pay qualified dividends. Now, the reason that this can be preferable here is because if you hold these assets for a year and a day, when you actually do sell them, you get long-term capital gains treatment, which is way more efficient than your ordinary income tax rates, right? So you can see here for 2025, that as married filing jointly, you can have up to $96,700 of long-term capital gains at the 0% tax rate, right? And even at the highest tax rate, you're only paying 20% tax on these long-term capital gains. And obviously, qualified dividends are treated as that long-term capital gains, whereas like interest from a bond is taxed as ordinary income, or non-qualified dividends are taxed as ordinary income. Well, you can see you'll pay up to 37% tax on that. So long-term capital gains treatment is twice as good, or half the expense of your ordinary income tax, right? So that's why we may want to do that. Now, if you do need to have bonds in a taxable account, you may want to consider munis in a taxable account because the interest of a municipal bond is tax exempt, right? And this would really depend on your marginal tax bracket. But one thing, it would almost never make sense to have munis here, right? I'm going to circle that and cross it out because a tax advantaged investment really has no business being in a tax advantaged account. Typically, munis, because they know their tax advantage is that they don't have to be as competitive as taxable bonds because they know that you're getting a tax benefit. And so really there's this equation to find the tax equivalent yield of municipal bonds compared to taxable bonds. But just high level things to think about. Now, when it comes to your Roth, what goes best in a Roth is, and it really depends how you're using the Roth, but for many retirees, this is their most tax advantaged account. It has the longest time horizon tied to it to maximize the benefit of any Roth conversions that you've done, or even legacy planning. This is the best account to leave behind because your heirs will have 10 years for this money to grow tax-free and compound before they have to pull it out. And so Roth, we really want your highest appreciating assets, right? So high appreciation, right? So maybe this is your US small value, right? Maybe this is your emerging market, maybe even international. How to actually apply this is very dependent on your unique situation, right? And the different types of accounts that you have and the balances in these accounts. But this is something that we're looking at extensively to figure out how can we optimize your after-tax spendable dollar, right? And how can we invest through asset dedication? How can we dedicate certain assets to certain jobs in your portfolio and place them in the account where we would expect the highest after-tax expected return, right? So those are the things that we're thinking about. Now, important in consideration, Anytime there's money in movement, there may be a tax consequence. Obviously, you can trade in your pre-tax accounts and Roth accounts without triggering taxable events, but buying and selling in your taxable account is going to trigger, a taxable event, involve a professional if you are unsure. The fee that you pay an advisor, the value that you get from a true financial planner is going to exceed the fee that you pay them to help put this together for your unique situation. We've talked about your income plan and whether we're optimizing for your sustainable spending or if we're optimizing, what to do, what levers to pull, work longer, save more, earn more, spend less to get you to your desired spending. Okay. Once we have that and know that about you, we can begin to dedicate certain assets in your portfolio to certain jobs. And then we think of how to place those assets inside of your accounts. Again, aiming to maximize your after tax expected return. Again, back to Mike and Sarah Johnson, $1 million, no pension, age 1658, wanting this to last 35 plus years in retirement. So their equity rate, again, this row right here in Elements is all about managing their risks. So their equity rate of their investable assets, only 46% of them are in the stock market. Now, that's the asset allocation, right? We would have to look at their actual statements to see their underlying holdings. We want to review and check, like, hey, is there a reason that they're invested the way that they are? Can this be optimized? Can we implement asset location and make their current holdings even more tax efficient just by holding them in the right accounts, right? Those are things that we're looking at here. Okay. Your insurance rate is very important as well. There are some risks that can totally derail your financial plan, right? And when you're young in life insurance, disability insurance, like these are huge financial risks that can totally derail the financial wellness of your family if something were to happen to you. But once you're financially independent, you don't really need life or disability insurance anymore, right? Because the whole point of life and disability insurance is to protect your human capital, your ability to turn your labor into wages for your dependents who are relying on you to turn your human capital into financial capital, right? But once you're financially independent, you've already managed that risk, right? Or it's not as big of a risk to you. However, personal liability is still something to consider. So once you've graduated from the get wealthy path, when you are on the stay wealthy path, we want to address these risks that could be catastrophic to your plan. Now, it's extremely unlikely you would ever have a claim with, a personal liability claim. And that's why personal liability policies tend to be pretty inexpensive, right? Here in Tennessee, it's about $200 for $1 million of coverage. If you want uninsured and underinsured coverage added on to that policy, it's probably about $400. So pretty inexpensive, unlikely you'll need it, but it's one of those things, if you ever needed it, you'd be glad you had it, right? Versus needing it and not having it. That would be a disaster. What I think about here, a lot of insurance companies, they won't even give you a personal liability policy unless your home and auto liability is adequate. And so it's a quick, just glance to make sure that you're not underinsured in your property and casualty insurance, right? And how do you know how much personal liability to add to your plan? So retirement accounts like Roth IRAs, 401ks, have built-in creditor protection because technically it's not your money, it's future use money, right? It's money set aside for future purpose or cause. And so, 401ks, ERISA actually protects them pretty extensively. IRAs often have, up to $1 million of creditor protection. Some states may protect them more or less. Brokerage account, cash, home, vehicles, assets outside of retirement accounts, so for Mike and Sarah, $1 million umbrella policy is adequate to cover that risk. Now, if we go back to insurance rate, one thing that it's not showing here is your health care, right? And your long-term care. And those are huge risks that we want to navigate before you pull the trigger on stepping away from work full time, right? And for healthcare, 100% I would recommend Move Health can help anyone in the nation. Typically, Move Health will only work with you through an advisor that is on their platform. Long-term care is potentially a huge spending shock in retirement. It often makes sense to address that risk before you step away from income, right? Because you're either going to buy insurance to transfer that risk, or you're going to be willing to self-insure, or you may want to use your home equity because oftentimes kids don't really want your home anyways because they're probably settled in their own job and home by the time they would inherit your home anyways, right? And some people may opt for even for friends and family to step in and help with their long-term care needs, right? So there's a couple different ways to manage long-term care. It is a potential risk. Now, if there's one more tile that needed to be added here to manage risk in retirement, I would put an estate planning tile right here. Like, do you have an estate plan? Do you have a will, a trust? Do you have power of attorneys? And if you have them, do they actually do what you want them to do? Like, have you moved to a different state recently? Do you need to update your documents so that they are concurrent with the state laws of which you reside? Do you have a blended family? Do you have real estate property in another state? Like, maybe a trust is really important. These is so important. Like, oh man, maybe you have an old 401k that you haven't checked the beneficiary designation long time, and maybe it has an ex-spouse named on there. Well, guess what? At that point, it doesn't matter what your will says. Like, your 401k passes via contract law, which is before like the will is even read or probate court, right? So, anyway, super important, the estate plan. Even once you have it, even if it's updated, the homework that comes from afterwards, updating your account titling. Like if you have a trust, funding the trust, titling the right assets in the name of the trust, reviewing all your beneficiary designations, make sure that they're aligned with your estate plan. Super, super important. Now, this second row, just to give you more context, by the way, before I explain this second row, I want to make sure you know that you can click the link in the description below, complete your own account here in Elements, and I'll review your unique situation. And you can schedule a time with me to review that. Now, this row, this income row, is really showing us that no matter how much money you make or have, you're doing one of four things with that money, right? You're either saving it, you're either spending it or giving it away, which is your burn rate. You're either paying down debt or you're paying taxes, right? So no matter what you're doing, it falls into one of those four categories. Having awareness of your cash flow is a huge necessity when planning for your retirement, right? This is so helpful to know how much money you're actually spending today. This is so important to know what your current lifestyle looks like as we're planning and prioritizing your retirement plan, right? And this last row is all about your assets and how long they can sustain your annual spending. So it's looking at your liquid term, so your liquid assets, your cash on hand, your taxable brokerage accounts, right? So for Mike and Sarah, they have 3.5 years where their liquid assets could cover their spending, right? Qualified term is how long could your retirement accounts, so your IRAs, Roth IRAs, 401ks, cover your annual spending. Your real estate term, so your home, rental properties, like if you had to tap into those assets, how long could they sustain your annual spending, right? Your business term, if you have a business and if you had to tap into that equity, how many years could it sustain your annual spending? And then your total term. So all of your assets combined gives you your total term. This says guaranteed income off. Well, we can see that Mike and Sarah are currently working in retirement. They won't have the salary, the wages, unless they choose to work part-time or do consulting or do something to earn more money in retirement. But they do have Social Security down the road, even though they don't have a pension, right? Mike's expected to earn about $3,000 a month in Social Security, and Sarah's about $2,000 a month in Social Security. Well, so eventually they'll turn on their Social Security, and you can see when they do like that, greatly increases their term, their liquid term, qualified term, real estate term, because now their assets only have to cover $10,000 of spending instead of the full $70,000 spending, right? All right, so I've shown you their situation, but let's go a little bit deeper. Let's look at their sustainable spending. Again, your income plan. How much can I spend, or how can I spend X? Well, looking at Mike and Sarah's situation, $1 million, no pension, they can spend about $5,830 a month, right? And you can see that these are after-tax spendable dollars, okay? And if we go here and you can see the cash flows, like if they retired today, what would it actually look like? Well, while they're waiting for Social Security, you can see their income is coming from their portfolio. So they are spending down their portfolio in these years. But eventually they'll turn on Social Security, and that's able to replace a lot of the income that they need. Now, one thing that I think is important, and if I go back to the dashboard, you see that this is based on dynamic income guardrails, right? And this is really based on your risk of overspending and your risk of underspending, and finding that sweet spot where if the market does really good and your risk of underspending is increasing, well, hey, we're going to increase your income so that you're maximizing your life while you have the time, resource, and energy to do so, right? But if markets go south and your risk of overspending increases, well, then we'll make that adjustment to cut spending back to make sure that your portfolio is lasting how long we need it to last for your life expectancy, right? So this is a dynamic process. This is really the value of of a good financial planner. The value of them is being a guide in changing landscapes, right? Not necessarily a defender of an outdated map, right? Because, I mean, guys, the calculation isn't really the valuable thing. You guys can go do your own calculations, right? The value of this is the peace of mind and the security and the real time help navigating uncertainty from somebody who's helped hundreds of people retire, right? Instead of you going through retirement for the first time, right? And obviously, like knowing how to be tax efficient and avoid common behavioral mistakes. In fact, Vanguard has done a study on the impact of real financial advisors, and they found that on average, investors do about 3% better a year than doing it on your own, right? Because unfortunately, the way that we're wired is that pain is more of a motivator than gain, than joy, right? And so when things are going well, we get greedy and we want to buy, so we're buying high. And then when things go low, we get scared and we want to sell to stop the pain and the loss, and so we sell low. And if you buy high and sell low and you do it enough times, eventually you're broke, right? But an advisor can help, especially with asset dedication and that time segmentation, knowing that you have bonds. Maybe you have a 7 to 15 year bond ladder that has immunized yourself from interest rate risk and even market risk for those years where your cash flow is guaranteed. Where if your stock portfolio, you don't need that money for 7 to 15 years. Well, psychologically, it's a lot easier to stick to that plan, even when you experience a downturn like 2008 in the Great Recession, or COVID in 2020, or even 2022 when stocks and bonds were down at the same time. Stocks down 20%, bonds down 10%. Like, there wasn't a safe place in your portfolio to sell. But if you had a bond ladder and you knew that you had cash coming in and you knew exactly how much cash to expect and it was based on your income plan, then you were isolated from that risk, right? So just more peace of mind. Anyways, there's a lot of value in working with a real financial planner. Now, you may find this helpful too. If we go to the tax lab, I want to end with this, right? So this is knowing which accounts to pull money from. And there's a lot of different ways to go about this. In fact, if I come back here, and if we're looking at the tax efficient way to pull money from your accounts, there's so many different ways that this can be gone about, right? Some people just pro rata pull from all of your accounts. A lot of times, common internet advice is use your taxable account first, your tax deferred account, and then your tax free account. But we can actually run the numbers on all of these distribution strategies to see what's actually going to help you have the lowest average tax rate, the lowest total taxes, the highest total net income, right? And we're even looking at Roth conversions and whether to fill the 0% bracket, fill the 12% bracket. Do we fill up to an IRMA threshold? IRMA, IRMAA, is income related monthly adjustment amount once you're age 65. If your income is too high. So IRMA, so based on your income, whether you're single or married, finally enjoying you can see at certain income levels, your premium for Part B and premium for Part D increases, right? So that's what your IRMA is. So do we cross that? Do we trigger that? When we're thinking about Roth conversions, where is the optimal place to convert? So in the case of Mike and Sarah, their optimal conversion is at 0%. Think about 0%, how's that possible? Well, again, if you step away from work and you have no wages or salary, and if you're not pulling money from the 401k, like really your only taxable income would be the income, the interest, capital gains from your taxable account. But every year you have a standard deduction. So wouldn't it, in Mike and Sarah's case here, it's saying, hey, if you retire today and you aren't taking Social Security for a while, and RMDs aren't for a while, like you have this period of time where you may be able to convert money to Roth up to your standard deduction amount and essentially get this money out that you haven't paid taxes on and transfer it to Roth so that the growth of it is now tax free. Like that, like if you weren't taking advantage of your standard deduction in this case for Mike and Sarah, like that would be a missed opportunity. On the same hand, it's not, it's not telling us to go higher and convert in the 24% tax bracket or whatever. You don't want to convert all your money to Roth because you want to leave some tax diversification in there, and allow yourself to make sure that you are taking advantage of your standard deduction each year. But even if we think long-term and about long-term care, pulling money from a pre-tax IRA or 401k is a really good place to fund your long-term care expenses because it will be taxable. The distribution will be taxable, but you'll be able to itemize deduct your medical expenses to wipe out a lot of that taxable income from the large distributions, right? So you don't, yeah, Roth is good. You don't want all Roth, just to leave some doors open. Also, if you're charitably minded, like you can give money, qualified charitable distributions from an IRA after age 70 and a half, and you can give money to a charity, your church, or whatever, tax free. Now you've seen how I optimize portfolios for long-term efficiency. Again, it starts with a specific income plan, whether we're solving for what your sustainable spending is today versus what we need to do to get you to be able to spend X, right? And from there, we think about asset dedication and how do we deploy the assets in your portfolio to specific jobs, right? To maximize the utility of these assets. From there, we're thinking about asset location and how do we maximize the tax efficiency of these investments and which accounts do we place them in? And then the last step was your distribution plan. Like, how are we actually pulling money out of these accounts? In which order to minimize your taxes, maximize your income? Certainly a lot going on there. I'd like to remind you, you're welcome to complete your profile in Elements using the link in the description below and schedule a time with me where we can review your unique situation. Thank you for staying with me to the end of the video, and I'll see you in the next one.